Good afternoon. I'm being censored already.
Test, test.
There we go. All right. Okay. I keep knocking it off. Now I know what to do. I won't make that error again. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ken Yalowitz, the director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding, and delighted to welcome you here today. This is really old home week because really one of our favorites has returned. Someone who's well known here and beloved by many of us, Professor Judy Byfield, was a Dartmouth alumna, went off to do her master's and PhD at Columbia, and then returned to Dartmouth to teach in the history department for several years. Very unfortunately, as far as I'm concerned, decided to leave and go off to Cornell, where she will actually begin teaching next year. This year, she was at, let me see if I get it right again, at the National Humanities Center in Durham, North Carolina. We're talking with Judy just a while ago. She's been very busy finishing up books and articles and everything else. And she's now in the process of actually moving up to Ithaca. But what I really wanted to pay tribute to Judy for, and this is in a way sort of a personal tribute, I've been here 5 years, and from my very first moments here, one of the people who really went out of her way to welcome me and to support the work of the Dickey Center was Judy Byfield. We were trying to get a global health initiative started, and she was right there at the very beginning, helping us, even though history and global health don't exactly, mesh directly, but she had the vision and the commitment to help us. And then as we've been working on the International Studies minor, it's gone through several iterations, but now it's an International Studies minor proposal, which I think in the fall term probably will, I hope, get its final approval. But again, Judy was with us, again showing the vision and commitment to a greater cause, if you will, of international studies and international understanding. And I really just want to thank you at this particular point for all the help that you've given to me and the Dickey Center. We're in the midst right now at Dartmouth, the Dartmouth Summer Arts Festival, Africa. And this year's theme, of course, is Africa, and it aims to enliven life on campus during the summer term by focusing on the vitality, hybridity, and creativity and global reach of Africa's many cultures. And the guiding force behind this wonderful program is the Leslie Center and Adrian Randolph, who's here. And we were delighted when we learned about this theme, and we were thinking, what's a way to get Judy Byfield back here? And we thought, perfect. What a perfect way to do it. The only thing is, I've threatened Judy. I told her about a month ago, I warned her. I said I was probably going to take her hostage while she was here and not let her go back, to Cornell. But the title of Judy's talk today is Rapping and Rapping, a wonderful play on words. I love that. Critiquing the body politic in post-World War II Nigeria. But before giving the floor to Professor Byfield, I also wanted to thank one of the members of the class of 2010, Jasmine Daniel. And Jasmine, raise your hand. Good. Jasmine is from Detroit and is an exceptionally talented person in many ways, but she has a wonderful artistic sense, and she curated, one floor up, the display of African textiles in the gallery, the Russo Gallery, right upstairs. And just to remind, in case any of you don't know, there's a wonderful reception in Judy's honor right after the conclusion of her talk in the gallery, so you can look at the beautiful fabrics. And also, I don't usually do anything like this, but I am going to make a pitch here. These fabrics are for sale. It's being done by a group called Salama, which is associated with the Dickey Center. It's a nonprofit organization, and the proceeds go to benefit an organization in Tanzania. It's called Bibi to Bibi, Grandmother to Grandmother, but basically they're working with grandmothers who are raising their grandchildren who are orphaned by AIDS. It's a really very worthwhile organization. And there's information up on the wall. You know, if you're interested in buying these fabrics, you may do so. And again, I'm not doing it, but as I say, it's up there, and I really welcome your taking a look at it. But now I'm delighted to turn the floor over to Professor Judy Byfield, and welcome home.
Good evening, everyone, and it really is a pleasure to be back. I was walking across from the Hanover Inn this afternoon, and I thought, gosh, this really is a beautiful campus. As Ken said, working with the Dickey Center was really very close to my heart, and actually particularly even working on the Global Health Initiative. When I was in graduate school, at one point, I wasn't quite sure if it was my calling. So I took a little break. And I actually worked with Planned Parenthood in New York City. I was a program organizer, and I organized seminars and sessions around health issues. Did a couple of sex ed classes with the international school, which was quite the experience. And so I want to encourage you also in the different capacities in which you're here to assist the Dickey Center, and particularly that Global Health Initiative program. I think it's really just a wonderful effort. As Ken said today, I'm talking about rapping, and yeah, it was a cute title. But I hope by the end of the talk you'll see how it really all does work together. In Yoruba culture, cloth and clothing convey a range of things: character, ideas, affiliations, and aspirations. They constitute an important part of the public discourse with both the physical and spiritual worlds. In this particular slide, what I want to point out here, this gentleman is an Ogboni member. Ogboni society was the civil arm of the pre-colonial government in Abeokuta, a Yoruba town in western Nigeria. And one of the things that distinguished Ogboni members was, in fact, this cloth that he has over his shoulder. In the old days, anyone who was not an Ogboni member who wore this cloth did so on the pain of death. So, you had to be an Ogboni member to wear this cloth. Anyone who saw him, an Ogboni member coming down the road, was expected to give deference to this particular chief. Given the importance of cloth as a medium of communication, cloth and clothing play significant roles in political debates and developments in Nigeria and Yoruba society specifically. Dress was an integral part of the development of nationalist thought, the beginning of the end of the late 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. Cultural nationalists of that era displayed their critique of colonialism by shedding Victorian dress and recommitted to what they considered as traditional Yoruba dress. And I've written on this elsewhere, and so we could talk about that if anyone had questions, talk about it a little bit more during the Q&A period. And we also have another expert on dress and cultural nationalism here from the 19th century, my colleague Leah Spitzer. So Leah could also answer questions if you wanted to ask about that in Sierra Leone. Now, this paper examines the ways in which women in Abeokuta use cloth and clothing to express their critique of politics in post-World War II Nigeria. It examines the multiple ways in which dress was incorporated into specific anti-colonial protests, as well as the ways in which cloth reflected the shift to nationalist mobilization after 1950. At the center of this story is the Abeokuta Women's Union, led by Mrs. Fumilayo Ransom Kuti, a British-trained teacher and wife of the headmaster of the Abeokuta Grammar School, the Reverend Ransom Kuti. And this is a picture here of the Reverend and Mrs. Ransom Kuti. And you see they're in the middle here. And notice they're both in traditional dress, and all their students are in Western suits. In 1947, the Abeokuta Women's Union mobilized women to resist the poll tax and a planned tax increase in Abeokuta. Once they successfully halted these plans, they increasingly turned their attention to nationalist politics and tried to interject women's voices and concerns in the emerging political agenda. An astute student of politics, Ransom Kuti and the union used dress in multiple ways to showcase supporters of their anti-tax protests and to call attention to women's issues during the nationalist era. And I first want to start off by just identifying what is traditional Yoruba women's dress. And I should point out that in this paper, I really am focusing exclusively on women's dress. By the 19th century, women's traditional dress consisted of a wrapper called an iro, a piece of cloth that was tied around the body from the waist to the ankle, sort of corresponding to our skirts, another cloth that was tied around their upper body, a headdress or gele, and another cloth that was used as a shawl. In this photograph, which I got from the John Holt papers in the Rhodes House Library in Oxford, and she was identified in this photo album as a typical Yoruba woman. Here you see the shawls, the cloths that she's wearing, this one, the iborun that's wrapped around her, this one around the upper body, and then the one around, that would be the skirt. I also want to point out that she doesn't have shoes. By the turn of the century, more women began to substitute a tailored blouse for the upper wrapper. This tailored blouse was called the buba, and the popularity of the buba reflected Christian influences as well as the dissemination of dressmaking skills. This is Ransom Kuti's mother, and here her mother has the iro, the wrapper, the buba, and you see that this is now tailored, the shawl, the gele, and she's wearing shoes. So by the 20th century, this was now what was considered traditional Yoruba women's dress. Now I want to get into talking about the protest that the Women's Union launched. The formation of the Women's Union cemented the political alliance between market women and the elite women of Abeokuta. And the organization the elite women belonged to was called the Abeokuta Ladies Club. And this organization had actually been formed by Ransom Kuti in 1932. This alliance grew out of literacy classes that the Ladies Club had organized in 1944. Through those classes, elite women became increasingly aware of the issues that market women faced, and Ransom Kuti in particular became an advocate for market women, going to the local council on their behalf and presenting their grievances. The members of the Women's Union, thus, once it came into existence in 1946, were a very diverse group. They were poor, wealthy, market women, teachers, shop owners, literate and non-literate. They also reflected the town's religious diversity, so they were Christian, Muslim, as well as practitioners of the traditional Yoruba religion. Many came from Abeokuta town, but many also came from outlying villages. Now, the organization's constitution reflected its strong economic diversity. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped this slide before. I'll just step back, point out a little bit here. This one taken in 1910. Again, you see a little bit more diversity in what the upper cloths, in the bubas. But again, the iro, the wrapper, remains constant in the traditional designs. I should also point out too, notice the men's dress, all very tailored, very similar to Western dress, outfits that Europeans would wear. Okay, this is the one that I needed now. The Constitution, as I was saying, reflected the socioeconomic diversity of the organization and as well as a desire for unity. So again, unity is a theme that keeps being stressed here, to maintain the unity, to defend, preserve, and also protect economic and political rights. I want to call attention particularly to the idea that they should cooperate with all organizations that are fighting genuinely and selflessly for economic and political freedom and the independence of the people. This is 1944. This is several years before the movement to self-government in Nigeria would actually sort of take fruition. So they're very much ahead of the curve of what will happen in the 1950s. Now, membership in the Women's Union, unlike the Ladies' Club, was open to all women in Abeokuta province. Their regular meeting days follow the calendar of the markets, thus making it easier for market women to participate. The Constitution also enshrined an advocacy role for the Women's Union. It required the union to, quote, always be ready to take up any financial member's complaints whenever such report is made known, unquote. The union's political charge was apparent in the organization's motto as well: unity, cooperation, selfless service, and democracy. Now, the union also had special rules that specifically alluded to its multi-class nature. In these special rules, the one that I will come back to later on is the first one here about, there should be moderation in the way members dress for public occasions. I'll come back to this to understand why this is a particularly intriguing rule. Now, one of the things to appreciate, though, about the Women's Union, and it's just one of the things that I think makes the Abeokuta Women's Union very distinctive from other women's organizations that emerged in other parts of the country, in that this was the one organization where you had market women and elite women in the same space. Particularly in the western part of the country, there was a long history of market women having their own commodity associations. In Lagos, the women's commodity associations there were very strong, had their own structure. And organizations formed by elite women did not incorporate the market women. Abeokuta is very distinctive in that regard. And one of the things I think it tells us is that in Abeokuta, elite women came to identify the issues of market women as their own issues. Now, the core issue that brought these women together was taxation. In June 1945, the government announced plans to increase the tax rate by 25%. The Alake, or the traditional king and sole native authority, actually helped to negotiate a postponement of this plan. He argued instead that they didn't really have to increase the tax rate, that if they just increased the income tax as opposed to the poll tax. There were two layers to this tax system: a poll tax, and everyone who earned less than £40 annually paid a poll tax, and men paid a higher poll tax rate than women. If you earned more than £40 annually, then you paid the income tax. But the Alake suggested that if they just increased the income tax and got more people paying the poll tax, that they could then make up the revenue that would come from a general tax increase. Unfortunately, those plans did not work. They didn't raise sufficient funds, so in November 1947, he finally raised the poll tax rate. Now, women in Abeokuta had been independent taxpayers since 1918, and this was actually an anomaly in Nigeria. There are only 2 provinces where women paid their tax independently of men. In the rest of the country, men were the taxpayers. The amount of tax that a man paid was actually pegged to the number of wives that he had. So the more wives a man had, the higher his tax bill. In Abeokuta, however, where at its very inception women were forced or required to pay tax, and it was actually at a time where women were doing quite well economically, so they did not resist the demand that they pay taxes, this became the practice. Now, 1947, though, was an entirely different situation. During the war, market women in particular had been hard hit by the sorts of economic restrictions that were imposed. The colonial government had set prices on local foodstuffs, so they capped the profits that market women could make during this era. On top of that, because of the war situation itself, imports, the price on imports escalated significantly, feeding a general inflation in the economy during this period. So, and in the post-war period, the restrictions that were imposed during the war were not lifted immediately. And in fact, some of the price controls stayed in effect right up through 1947. So market women were still in a situation where economically they were hurting. On top of that, because tax collectors were supposed to increase the taxes that they brought in, collectors went about their work with special zeal. They accosted people in the motor parks, on the streets, and in the markets, demanding to see tax receipts. Young girls were sometimes stripped of their tops, since collectors believed that they could estimate from the size of their breasts if they were old enough to pay taxes. And if you failed to produce a tax receipt, you went to jail. So, given the economic crisis these women had been experiencing from the Depression right up through the war and in the post-war period, the zealousness of tax collectors, this demand for this tax increase had really hit a raw nerve. Now, the tax increase, although it was the central issue that galvanized the majority of women in the town and in the rural areas, the women's union used the tax issue as a launch pad to actually call into question a range of other issues that they had. For example, they pointed out the fact that the Alake was authoritarian. They also pointed out that there were numerous charges against him as well as his agents of corruption, and the fact that they were politically marginalized. This council that ruled in conjunction with the Alake when it was created in 1918 did not invite any of the women chiefs to participate. And so in a society where women had had very active political roles through the pre-colonial period, the colonial period was actually a step back for women politically. Just so help you get a sense, this is the Alake here. And this was the British resident at the time of the tax revolt, Resident Schofield. Now, women's political marginalization was especially glaring since Abeokuta during this period was actually supposedly in the process of expanding political representation on the council. In the 1938 intelligence report authored by the resident John Blair, he described the Alake's rule as authoritarian and advised democratizing the sole native authority system. In 1941, a new Egba Council was actually inaugurated, but its expanded representation was conceived only in spatial terms, that is, having representatives from all the townships that made up Abeokuta. Neither gender nor social class were given any consideration. The local newspapers, in their editorials, promptly attacked the composition of that council in 41 because it did not include literate men. But they were silent on the issue of even literate women. So it was left to the Women's Union now to call attention to this gap in the discussion of democracy. And the Women's Union used a variety of strategies to register their displeasure with the overall economic and political affairs. They wrote petitions to the Alake and the resident. They organized mass rallies outside the courts in the jails whenever women were arrested for not paying taxes. They organized vigils in the palace, where they effectively held the Alake under siege. And I should point out here that they are strolling in the compound of the palace. And the palace has an outer wall, but also inside that wall is his residence and a meeting place, but also a significantly large field where people could congregate for meetings, for events. And during these vigils, women sometimes were inside that between his residence and the outer wall, and then beyond the outer wall. And they held two of these vigils. One was a 2-day vigil and one was a 3-day vigil. And during these vigils, they literally would not let him leave the palace compound. During the vigils, they also sang abusive songs to the Alake. And the second song is very clear there. You know, this is about women's power, and they are taking vengeance on him. But I want to talk a little bit about the first song. The first song, the one that reads, "This Oro festival has no regard for men. This Oro could carry men away even from their rooms. There is no regard for men. We are celebrating." This is particularly important because Oro was associated with the Ogboni Society, that old civil arm of the pre-colonial Abeokuta government. In the pre-colonial period, the chiefs who were on the Ogboni were mostly older, wealthy men, but also a few post-menopausal women. Women who were still of childbearing age were thought to have a lot of power that they couldn't control. And so it's only older women who were post-menopausal who could control the power associated with women and keep secrets. So if you were menstruating, you couldn't keep secrets. So it's only older women then, post-menopausal women, who were on the Ogboni Council. The Ogboni Council held the power of life and death. They were the people who could decide if someone had committed a serious enough transgression that warranted execution. The Oro was the enforcer of the Ogboni. It was the Oro who carried out executions. Now, regardless of a woman's status, women could never see Oro. And once it was announced that Oro would be out, women had to go indoors and stay away from windows and doorways. The practice was that any woman who saw the Oro would in fact be killed. And up until in the first decade, one of the latest reports I saw of this was actually in the 1920s. So this enforcement was maintained very seriously. This cultural backdrop then makes this song especially potent, for with it the women subverted the icon's association with male power and seniority. By performing their own oral festival, male power was being rendered silent and invisible. Now, the AWU's protests literally rocked colonial rule in Abeokuta. Violence broke out between supporters of the Women's Union and supporters of the Alake. Alake supporters were also subjected to beatings, and in several instances, their homes were attacked. Chief Shorunke, who is the first slide I showed you, recalled that there was a set of young men supporters who he characterized as thugs because, quote, they not only attacked Ogboni, but all Egba chiefs, stoning and damaging their properties, unquote. And the question of violence itself had been of concern to Ransom Kuti and the executive of the Women's Union, for the union laid out rules of conduct for the protests. Women were told not to bring any weapons, such as guns, cutlasses, batons, gas, or anything that could cause injury. Participants were also instructed not to abuse anyone, but we know they didn't follow that rule. As the town became increasingly tense, officials considered calling in the army. However, the 1948 annual report noted that, quote, by April, an opportunity to suppress the movement by force had clearly vanished, and it had acquired by that time the general support of the masses and intelligentsia. The annual report also aptly captured the dramatic outcome of the protests. The year 1948, and this I'm reading from the report, the year 1948 has been one of the most momentous in the history of Egba land. The year has seen the departure from Abeokuta on July 29th after demonstration by the women of the Alake Ademola II. He took up residence at Oshobo and presented the Egba Native Authority the instrument of abdication on 31st December 1948. So essentially, the women had forced him out of town. And given the colonial government's strong support of the Alake since he took office in 1920, and he had gotten CBEs, the war's commander of the British Empire, he was a well-appreciated African ruler. So for them to force him to leave town under these circumstances was in fact a major achievement. So how did dress, though, come into all of this? Well, as a member of the Christian educated elite and a founding member of the main nationalist organization during this period, the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons, Ransom Kuti understood the power and politics of dress, and many argued that she used it quite effectively. Her biographers, Cheryl Johnson Odim and Nina Umba, note that after the late 1940s, you do not find any pictures of her in anything other than Yoruba dress. So early pictures of her actually show her in very standard Western dresses. After this period, all the Western dresses are thrown out of her closet. I interviewed her daughter actually at one point, and her daughter said she also maintained that practice at home. So at home and in public, she only wore Yoruba dress. Her husband, on the other hand, only wore Yoruba dress for special occasions. And at home, he tended to wear Western dress. Ransom Kuti's sartorial choice revitalized that practice that had waned among the educated elite following the cultural nationalist surge at the beginning of the 20th century. She used Yoruba dress to express anti-colonial sentiment and to declare her identification with the majority of poor women she identified. But she also extended this thinking into her language use. When speaking to colonial officials on behalf of the Women's Union, she spoke in Yoruba and had her words translated into English for the colonial authorities. Such actions clearly demonstrated her political loyalties to the majority of Egbo women who primarily spoke Yoruba in the course of their daily interactions and wore traditional dress. But a second level of politics, of dress politics, was also at work. And here I'm going to come back to the special rule that there should be moderation in the way members dress for public occasions. Because one of the things I think it suggests is that the leadership wanted to show even visual unity among the women participating in the protests. It discouraged women of means from dressing elaborately or in ways that would distinguish them from women of lesser means. And in addition to moderate dress, informants noted that women also wore white head ties or carried white handkerchiefs. The white head ties and white handkerchiefs in particular signified support for the Women's Union. So this moderation in dress, along with the white head ties, as you see in this image, achieved a certain level of uniformity and rendered this diverse group of women into a group of visual equals. The protesters also practiced what I refer to as the politics of undress. In Wole Soyinka's memoir, Ake, The Years of Childhood, he vividly describes one instance leading up to a moment of undress. According to Soyinka, one of the council members, the Balogun of the Egbas, a very high-ranking Ogboni chief, allegedly remarked, quote, "The world is spoiled. The world is coming to an end when these women can lay siege to the palace and disturb the peace. Go home and mind your kitchens and feed your husbands. What do you know about the running of state affairs? Not pay taxes indeed. What you need is a good kick in your idle rumps." As a result of the Balogun's insults, the women stripped his fellow council members of their clothing and used their chiefly regalia to beat them. Soyinka's mother, however, did not agree with this, and she hid at least one of these council members in her shop. But stripping critics of their clothes was not an isolated incident. Even in the Egba Council minutes, there were notes made of many instances in several parts of the towns where supporters of the women assaulted women, quote, "in the public streets by stripping them into nakedness and ridiculing them," unquote. Interviews revealed that some women also exercised their own politics of undress by removing their own clothing outside the palace. Participants spoke of older women stripping naked or down to a small underskirt as they call for the Alake to leave office. In Yoruba society, it's a taboo for you to see an elderly woman naked, and it was suggested that it could even result in the death of the intended viewer. So this act of undressing in public expressed the women's deep contempt for the Alake. By removing their clothes, the women symbolically removed their respect for Ademola and ultimately stripped him of his authority. They were adamant that Ademola had to go, and by taking off their clothes, they not only revealed their bodies, they also revealed their resolve. And we know he left. Now, the AW's success inspired great mobilization both in Abeokuta itself and around the country. With the Alake's departure, 4 women were brought onto the interim council that was created, one of those women being Mrs. Ransom Kuti, and one of the first things they did was to abolish taxes on women. The Abeokuta also launched its own program for women's economic and political development. They started an industrial center where they hired a weaver to create cloths. And notice this loom that they purchased it from Europe. And the cloths that were woven here were sold in a shop that they created. They also created a child welfare clinic where they hired a doctor and a midwife. However, they were competing with several other clinics, one that had been established by the Alake and run by Nurse Makata here, who I was told was a real pistol. Um, um, Colonial officials who I interviewed told me that Nurse Makata lived in the GRA, the Government Reserve Area, and she would set out for this clinic where market women came for service at 4 in the morning. But she didn't think it was right that she was the only one up at 4 in the morning. So as she drove out of the GRA, she pressed her horn and woke everybody up. Across Nigeria, men and women wrote to Ransom Kuti seeking her help to create similar women's union. Now, I should point out that before the success of the women's union in Abeokuta, Ransom Kuti had been somewhat of a national figure. She was the only member on a 7-member delegation. She was the only woman, rather, on a 7-member delegation of the NCNC that had gone to London in 1947 to demand political participation for Nigerians. The NCNC had specifically challenged the constitution that was implemented in 1954, which is known as the Richards Constitution, because of the way that it was foisted on the country and because it did not create space for nationalists to participate in government. This 7-member delegation did a nationwide tour, so Ransom Kuti people got to see her or meet her in other parts of the country. But it's clear that it was after the success of the Abeokuta Women's Union in 47, 48, that she really cemented her position nationally. And she became identified most specifically as a women's leader. In 49, building on the success of the Women's Union and the demands for her to help create more women's unions around the country, Ransom Kuti actually created a new umbrella type of organization, which was the Nigerian Women's Union. And on that organization, the Abeokuta Union was just a member branch. All the new unions were created, but even previously existing women's organizations in other parts of the country also joined the Nigerian Women's Union. This organization, or this combination of organizations, operated at both at actually 3 levels: local, regional, and national. At the local levels, branches continue to challenge poll taxes. They also fought for a reduction in bride price in each region. This actually was an issue of particular concern. High bride prices made it difficult for young men to marry because they had to accumulate much more money in order to what bride price did in a sense was to reimburse families for having raised the daughters that these young men were now marrying. They weren't purchasing their daughters, even though the term bride price got associated with the practice. However, when bride price was high, it was difficult for young men to marry, but relatively easier for wealthy older men to marry and take multiple brides. Women had a particular concern around this issue because if they were in a marriage that was not satisfactory and they wanted to divorce, they had to refund the bride price. So women did not want to see high bride price because that actually kept them stuck in marriages. So on the local level, the different branches of the Women's Union were attacking these issues. Ransom Kuti was also speaking at or addressing national issues because in the movement, In 1948, the colonial government announced that they were going to revise the Richards Constitution, in fact, much earlier than had been anticipated. And so they held meetings all around the country at village levels. Then they created sort of province level meetings and then regional meetings. And Ransom Kuti spoke at these regional meetings, bringing up the whole issue of the poll tax, of bride price, of women's lack of political participation in various levels of government structures. That announcement about the revision of the Constitution actually radically altered the political terrain in Nigeria at this period. One of the things that it did was to accelerate the development of political parties, because it became clear now that the colonial government was going to put in place some sort of electoral process that would allow Nigerian nationalists to participate in the government structure. It also made it clear that self-government, self-rule was going to come much sooner than anyone had anticipated. The NCNC, to which Ransom Kuti belonged, began at its inception as a pan-Nigerian nationalist organization. After the 48 announcement, the NCNC started transforming into a political party, and into a political party that was going to be increasingly defined ethnically as well as regionally. So the NCNC by the 1950s would be seen predominantly as the Igbo party within Nigeria. In the West, this is the picture of the Women's Union executive. Sorry, I skipped that. In the West, the dominant party was the Action Group. In the North, the dominant party was the Northern People's Congress. Now, given this new organization, where you're moving away from pan-Nigeria groups to regional and ethnically defined groups, local associations had to figure out ways to negotiate this new terrain. Ransom Kuti remained a member of the NCNC even though it was now identified as a largely Igbo party. But she refused to bring the women's organizations into the NCNC. And this became a major political challenge for her during the 1950s. She was pressured by NCNC executives who were now primarily concerned with votes, that she bring these organizations with their thousands of women under the fold of the NCNC. The fact that she refused this out through the entire 1950s, I think speaks to the challenge that she put towards the way that nationalism was evolving. She used the organizational space of these groups, the Women's Union, the National Women's Union, to challenge the sort of ethnic nationalism that was emerging, as well as the regional political structure that had emerged. But in addition to challenging them organizationally, once again, she used cloth as a part of her critique. This was a cloth she had printed for the Nigerian Women's Union in 1957. It was produced by a company in Germany. And I just want to spend the last few minutes here just taking us through the design of this cloth. So here you see, I think of this as a command: don't lie. By the 1950s, it was clear that politicians were doing what politicians often do. So this cloth had "don't lie." It also had a picture of Ransom Kuti, and here they use her nickname, at the top is Mrs. Kuti, at the bottom it's Bere, and Bere means firstborn girl. And she actually acquired that name or that nickname because she was in the first class of girls that attended the Abeokuta Grammar School in 1914. And on the list of the female students that were in the school, her name was at the top of the list. So she was considered the firstborn girl of the Abeokuta Grammar School. And the nickname stuck with her. And then the last command, don't take bribes. Ransom Kuti, in an interview she did in 1962, argued that from as early as 1951, when the new constitution was put in place, that you began to see the power of money in political practice. And she argued that it was because the colonial government at that time made it known that they would be given allowances to the governmental representatives. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the symbol of the woman kneeling with her hands up to the ray of the sun. This was a symbol that she used on the NWU's newspaper, and the newspaper was called the Nigerian Sunshine. And I think there's some really interesting things going on in this symbol here. In many ways, it reflects the Yoruba concept of Olaju, which has to do with enlightenment. In Yoruba society, they welcomed innovation. They welcomed the introduction of new ideas, new practices. We saw it in terms of in fact, even cloth, all the imports that were brought into the mix. Here, though, enlightenment, it was something that was celebrated. And so one of the arguments that I want to make is that in this instance, part of what she is doing is suggesting that women are open to enlightenment, to the rays of the sun. But also, since the newspaper was named Nigeria's Sunshine, that women were Nigeria's sunshine. Women were going to be the agents of enlightenment in this nationalist period. The other thing I want to point out is this palm tree. Because the palm tree had historically been important to the economic vitality, particularly of Western and Eastern Nigeria. Women were the ones who processed the fiber from the palm fruit into palm oil. Women also owned the kernel, the seed inside the palm nut, and from that they processed palm kernel oil. Part of what I think this suggests is, again, the important economic role that women played in Nigerian society and would continue to play in Nigerian society. Now, I'm still on the lookout for pictures of women wearing this particular cloth. I haven't found them yet. But you can just imagine a sea of women dressed in this cloth would speak volumes to observers. For the cloth communicated their engagement with and their criticism of nationalist politics. Don't take bribes. As well as their resolve to be a part of this process on their own terms. So from these examples, I think we can appreciate the multiple ways in which cloth and dress were integral to political action, debate, and commentary. As a historian trying to elicit people's memories of this period, it became clear too that dress had also helped to imprint these events on their memories. Participants in the anti-tax campaign animatedly recalled the singing and the dancing, the white head ties, and the waving of the white handkerchiefs. With equal animation, they recalled those moments when clothing was removed and bodies exposed. In the symbolic rich landscape of Yoruba culture, dress provided a vocabulary as well as a tool through which women registered their political opinions. This practice of using cloth to speak about politics has not abated, and I will end here with a few samples from the work of a contemporary Nigerian artist, Wole Lagunja, which demonstrate that the relationship between cloth and political commentary is alive and well. And here you see he has taken gourds and literally wrapped them with adire cloth. And I think we can read a lot from this, from his title, The Fruits of the Tree of Knowledge, where's haute couture. So it's an interesting way that he plays with it here too, because, the tree of knowledge that produces, in a sense, these gourds, but it's also out of the local culture that adire emerges here. But it's borrowing from the outside by the type of cloth that's used to actually make the adire. The last slide, I think, is clear and self-explanatory. Okay, I will end there. Thank you. Yes, yeah. Peggy?
I wanted to first comment and then ask about the unwrapping issue and the women, the elderly women stripping as a way of signifying their contempt, their derision for the powers that be. There's an incident in during the French Revolution when the commissioner from the revolutionary government has gone out to the countryside because the women there are resisting the de-Christianization campaign, and he's called all the women leaders, he thinks, of the village together in the village hall to tell them that if they don't get this out, he's going to have them all imprisoned, and they mooned him. And he ran out, and then was writing back to Paris saying, like, I don't know what to do. So I mean, it's very, very similar situation. I can give you the reference.
Oh yeah, I would love that.
But the other, I wanted, so you also had that there were women members of the union stripping other women, or I wasn't quite sure. Or people were stripping women's union members.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear. No, there were other people being stripped. It's not clear from what I've seen if these were actually members of the women's union who were stripping these other people. And my sense is and these were some of the things I got out of the council minutes. It seemed that it was mostly men who were being stripped, and but I don't know if women were doing the stripping or if male supporters were doing the stripping of the men who were supporters of the Alake.
Okay, so it's supporters of the Alake who are getting stripped.
Yeah.
Not supporters. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I misunderstood that.
Roberta?
Did anybody, I'm really fascinated by putting political messages on the clothing. It's like bumper stickers. And I was wondering well, yeah, I mean, Nigerian bumper stickers. But I was wondering where she got that idea, or if that was her, and if anybody else used print to, make other political messages. They're wearing their politics. It's really wonderful.
And it's not unique to the women's union at all. This was a really long-standing practice. And it goes back to the way, I think, historically, that with the idea that cloth is a medium for communication. So if you, for example, wanted a child and you wanted to ask the deities to get a child for you, you would wear a cloth that had the symbols of that particular deity. And later on, when writing becomes more common in society, you see other cloths that have different types of writings on them. So when the Alake actually was coronated in 1920, a special cloth was made with his face on it. When George V was also coronated, again, there were cloths sent to Nigeria that had George on it too. So this was something that happened very often. And even to the leader of the action group, the primarily Yoruba party that emerged by 51 or 1950, Awolowo, he died early 80s or mid 80s. And I think he died 84 because I was in Nigeria for the 1-year anniversary of his death, and you were just seen in like a sea of women in wrappers with Awolowo's picture on it.
In that same cloth that she was referring to, the AWU cloth that you analyzed, what I found interesting, and I wonder if you could say something more about it, is that it looked like cloth that was actually foreign printed rather than locally tie-dye or locally produced, and that the patterns on that were quite un-African, if I want to say it, except for the centerpieces. So I was wondering if you can say something about it.
Yeah, from what I have found, I found the communication between Ransom Kuti and this firm. And again, getting cloth from Europe was not a new thing. And in fact, one of the, because Nigerian and southern Nigeria in particular, and Yoruba society really had this strong desire for new fabrics. They did not shy away from imports. They were not, carried away by this idea that they only had to use locally produced cloth. So there was always this desire for imports. It became a problem certainly later on as the imports really, particularly the inexpensive imports, had a deleterious effect on locally produced cloth. So from in the early 20th century, you had women traders, cloth traders, who would actually work with the agents of the European companies and create designs that were then taken back to Europe and produced and then brought back to Nigeria and sold in the local markets. So there was a great deal of communication over designs that had historically happened. And so in a way, Ransom Kuti was carrying on something. The other thing about it too, I think we have to think about the technology. And so the technology involved in putting her picture on this cloth wouldn't necessarily have been available in Nigeria at this time. And so to do something like that, I'm sorry, you really needed to go to Europe for that sort of stuff. You don't begin to see sort of machine-produced cloth in Nigeria, industrially produced cloth in Nigeria, till towards the end of the 50s and more into the 60s, because it's really with independence that there's a push for industrialization. And it's the national governments, the nationalist government, that will push to create the factories that could produce that sort of cloth. So it made economic sense, particularly given what she wanted to be on the cloth, and probably in the quantities that she wanted, to have it ordered in Europe. Leslie.
That was really interesting. I was wondering if you could say more about how the origins of women's activism here, like before 1947. And it sounds like, from what you said, that Abeokuta has this very interesting and robust kind of political culture where women are, economic actors already, but so is it local traditions they're calling on? Is it international movements? Is it both?
Actually, it's a combination. One of the interesting things in her letters, and she was very prolific, and particularly since she used the newspapers a lot too. In her files, there are all these speeches and letters that she wrote. She sent off to the newspapers. She was communicating with Nkrumah. She also was the vice president in the Women's International Democratic Federation, which was an Eastern Bloc international women's association, and she was vice president in '57. And also the fact that she had gone to school in Britain in the early 20s, she was aware of a lot of what was happening politically in Europe. And so you see references to some of these things. When the ministers in Nigeria are trying to tell her that, you women should wait. We've got to get the state first, and then we'll get to you. She's saying, well, even the British realize women should be in the parliament. We don't have to wait. But even with that, though, she also is appreciative of their own local tradition of women's activism. And one of the things that she did, and I don't talk about it in this paper, but in one of the chapters that I'm working on, in the 19th century, as I said, women held titles. And in fact, one of the ways to co-opt powerful women was to pull them into the state structure. And one of the most powerful women in the 19th century was a woman named Madame Tinubu, who was a big-time trader. She traded in ammunition, slaves, and palm oil. And she had, because of the insecurity of the period too, large-scale traders had to have their own sort of militia. And so here you have this powerful woman with her own armed people. So they gave her a title. And Tinubu saw herself as a kingmaker. So she had people she wanted to become alake, and so she would put them forward. When her first candidate, didn't get accepted, she refused to recognize him and actually led to his downfall. During the women's protests now in '47, they would go to her grave to pray before the protests and ask for her strength and support and guidance. And after the Alake had to run out of town, and I interviewed the colonial official who actually was tasked with getting him out of town, he told me that they had to leave at midnight. So he literally had to sneak out of town. They had this big celebration at Tinubu's grave. And Tinubu is an important icon for them through this whole process. And I think it's precisely because she was a political figure. And it's their way of reminding them that which is a charge so often thrown at feminists today, is that, oh, you're just being influenced by the West. You're acting outside of your culture. What she was doing in '47 was making it clear that, yes, she sees what's going on in Europe and she's appreciative of it, but what they're doing is not only a derivative of what's going on in Europe, that they have history here and they have precedents on their side. Laura?
There are two questions here, and one of them I'm really interested in. How do the elite women come to identify with the market women?
Yeah.
And maybe connected to this, and maybe not, is the question I have about taxes.
Mm-hmm.
And when women begin to get taxed, or what the relationship is between, I'm wondering about these tax officials who imagine that they can look at adolescent girls and make a determination about whether or not they are earning money, or what that process then becomes by which adolescent girls become taxable.
Well, one of the intriguing things, and I don't have an answer for this yet, is that actually girls started paying taxes before boys. So girls would be taxed at 15, and boys didn't have to pay taxes till 16. And it's when the tax system gets imposed in 1918. And at that time, what they created was a village assessment. So you had officials who essentially went to the villages, and depending on where they were located, so villages that were in the cocoa producing areas that had more money, had more traders in their vicinity, got a higher tax bill. And the chiefs just demanded that women and men contribute to paying the village assessment. Well, that led to a tax revolt, a rural tax revolt, where guns did come out. One of the chiefs got killed. They tore up the railway line. And somebody in London, because it was Lord Lugard who had really pushed to have taxes imposed during, in fact, this had started 1916. Somebody said only Lugard would have tried to do this during the war. At that particular revolt, women also participated in the revolt. And there were some women who got wounded during that revolt. It was after that revolt that they implemented the poll tax, so that you had then this individual tax system as opposed to the sort of generic village tax system. But because women had, from the inception, been made to pay, they continued paying. But they didn't necessarily, and again, timing I think is really important. They didn't complain about paying tax per se, and in fact use the fact that they were taxpayers to challenge the colonial authorities. So the woman who was the Ialode, and I should have pointed out earlier, the title that Tinubu was given in 1864 was Ialode of the town. She was the women's representative to the Alake, which effectively recognized women as a political constituency. Her successor was around at the time of the 1918 tax revolt. And her successor, they did a commission of inquiry into the tax revolt, and they interviewed her. And this woman, Madame Jojolola, who also happened to be an Adire dyer, which is how I got interested in her. But she said, here it is, we're taxpayers, and we get no benefit from this. So they were also arguing that they didn't necessarily see paying tax as a bad thing, but they expected the state to support them, particularly in their economic activities, precisely because they were taxpayers. One of the things too about this tax issue is that it can cut multiple ways. So on one hand, in 47 now, part of Ransom Kuti's argument is that you have all these poor women who are being forced to pay a poll tax whether or not they can afford it. That should be stopped. She wasn't against the income tax. But you also had men arguing that, no women should pay taxes. And some women were agreeing with this too, and their argument was that it's a man's job to pay taxes. And she didn't go that way either. By the 1950s, when representative government is developing now, she actually made arguments. She did not try to link taxpayer status to political participation. She found she had to decouple it. And part of the reason she had to decouple it was precisely because the parties were using it to keep women out of the political process. So when the Action Group came to power in the Western region in the 50s, they only allowed tax-paying women on the voter rolls, and not the poll tax-paying women, the income tax-paying women. So the argument shifts in the mid-50s away from linking taxation to voting to the argument for universal adult suffrage. And that's how she begins to reframe the discussion. So by independence in 60, there is universal adult suffrage in the West and the East. In the North, where the dominant party was the conservative House of Parties, they used that to argue against women voting. So women in the North didn't get the vote until 1977. I think, okay.
About shoes, you point out that in two slides, one wears shoes, one doesn't. Is there any particular reason?
Yeah, I pointed that out because that actually became a bit of an for the educated elite, particularly, so you had the group of elite who adopted fully European dress, and shoes was a standard part of that. And so this was, again, one way of expressing your membership into this social group. The majority of people didn't wear shoes. There's a type of a sandal, slipper type that Ransom Kuti's mother had on there. But again, people may wear that for special occasions, but it wasn't the standard practice to really wear shoes. Some missionaries supported this idea of the Christianized elite really adopting the full European, sartorial thing, including shoes. But there are some missionaries who actually weren't so happy with people wearing shoes because they were moving away from the local culture as they saw it. And so shoes became one piece in that larger debate and discussion about, in a sense, what was appropriate dress as people, came into more money or moved from one social group to another. And Lugard, and I talk a bit about this more in the first book, because Lugard is a really interesting person in all of this too. He became Governor General of sort of the consolidated northern and southern Nigeria in 1912, is it? I'm trying to remember. Nelson, I'm looking at you. 14, right, yeah, 1914. Lugard didn't like Africans wearing European dress because Lugard believed that European officials had to maintain both physical and social distance from Africans. And so he also figures in these discussions about architecture and the planning of these European areas. So he used to believe that mosquitoes could distinguish between European and Africans. So they built this mild cordon sort of between the African villages and the European GRAs. So Africans, of course, you needed them to work in the European areas, but they had to leave by 6 o'clock before the mosquitoes came out. But I mean, Lugard was really into this sort of maintaining the stature and the superiority of Europeans. And one of the ways in which you maintained that was by making sure Africans didn't dress like you.
I'm wondering, I don't think you answered the second part of her question about how the affinity was developed between the elite women and the market women. And I'm also struck by the fact that women today in Nigeria are using some of these same techniques, focused on the unwrapping, as I understand it, in some of the oil areas.
Yeah, you're definitely still seeing that. And then there was the really famous Women's War in eastern Nigeria in 1929, where again, women took their clothes off and also beat colonial officials. That question of how this alliance was formed, in many ways, I think Ransom Kuti is central to that. Because I think having the literacy classes really brought them together in the same space. And it was also really clear that it became it created occasions for them to appreciate their commonalities as well as their differences. And one of the things that there was agreement, I think, across or consensus on was the importance of education. And so many people, when they're writing about education, again, just sort of stress that of the elites and that the elites valued education. But the market women did too. And one of the things they appreciated was that education helped them in the market because they couldn't get cheated as easily if they too could read and write. So they really wanted to be able to understand the negotiations or what they were signing when they negotiated with traders, the European traders and other traders as well. So I think the literacy classes were central to that too. But I think it's also the political framework that Ransom Kuti created in the context of those literacy classes. Because very early on, she's attracted to socialism. She's attracted to the Fabians. She considers Arthur Creech Jones a friend. And so she writes to him often, complaining about what the Alake was doing and all that stuff. And really saw one of the statements I have from her where, she said, you can't judge the progress of the country by looking to see who, in a sense, by looking at the people who are drinking tea with sugar. You have to look to see what the people in the markets are doing. So from very early on, she identifies, what is happening to poor people as a major center of her political activism. And I think that is the framework that she really adopts in these literacy classes. So I think that contributes to the fact that you get this alliance being created where in other parts of the country, I don't think you have anyone who's doing that same sort of consciousness raising in a sense. So that market women are over here, elite women are over here, they may come together for one or two events, but they're not working collectively.
Last question. Well, thank you very, very much.